The photograph is almost impossible to look at. A German transport driver stands beside his horses somewhere on the Western Front in 1917. All three wear gas masks. The horses' masks are grotesque contraptions of canvas and leather covering their entire heads, with goggled eye holes that make them look like creatures from a nightmare. The driver's mask is equally disturbing, but it's the horses that command attention. Their ears poke through specially designed holes in the fabric. Their eyes, barely visible behind clouded glass, seem to ask a question that has no answer. This image, preserved in the archives of the Imperial War Museums, captures a moment when warfare had become so poisonous that even the animals had to be armored against the very air they breathed. It represents one of the most overlooked chapters of World War I, a story of 8 million horses, donkeys, and mules who served in a conflict that would kill most of them. But this isn't just a story about animals dying in war. Every war kills animals. This is about something more specific, more technological, more modern. This is about what happened when human beings invented a weapon that didn't discriminate between soldier and horse, between man and beast, between combatant and the creature simply trying to haul a gun through the mud. The story begins before the gas, before the masks, in a world that still moved on 4 legs. When war broke out in August 1914, the major powers of Europe possessed the most technologically advanced militaries in human history. They had machine guns, aircraft, submarines, and artillery that could fire shells 20 miles. But they also depended completely and utterly on horses. The British Army went to war with 25,000 horses. Within a week, they had requisitioned 140,000 more. By 1917, Britain was importing 1,000 horses per week from North America. France mobilized 630,000 horses in August 1914 alone. Germany entered the war with 715,000 horses. The Austro-Hungarian Empire brought 600,000. Russia, with its vast territories and limited rail network, required 2.1 million horses just to move its armies into position. These weren't cavalry horses, not most of them. The romantic image of mounted charges belonged to an earlier age. These were transport animals, artillery horses, supply horses. They pulled the guns. They hauled the ammunition. They moved the field kitchens, the medical supplies, the telephone wire, the engineering equipment, everything an army needed to function. A single British artillery battery required 200 horses. A German infantry division needed 5,000. The armies were enormous mechanical systems, and horses were the parts that made them move. The Western Front, that 450-mile wound that ran from the Swiss border to the North Sea, became a landscape specifically designed to kill horses. The mud alone was lethal. After the first winter, after the trenches had been dug and the drainage systems destroyed, the ground became a morass that could swallow a horse whole. Passchendaele, fought in the autumn of 1917, was notorious for drowning men in shell craters filled with liquid mud. Horses suffered worse. They were heavier, their hooves gave them less surface area, and when they went down, they couldn't be rescued. Thousands died stuck in the mud, exhausted, drowning in inches of water, while handlers watched helplessly from firmer ground. The artillery killed them by the thousands. Shells didn't distinguish between a German ammunition column and the horses pulling it. Shrapnel tore through their unprotected bodies. High explosive shells created concussive waves that ruptured internal organs even when fragments missed. The casualty statistics for horses on the Western Front match those of human beings in their scale and horror. On a single day during the Battle of Verdun in 1916, French forces lost 7,000 horses. At the Somme, where 19,000 British soldiers died, on July 1, 1916, approximately 1,000 horses died alongside them, and that was just the first day. But the artillery and the mud were known quantities. Humans had been killing horses in war for thousands of years. What came next was different. On April 22, 1915, at 5 in the afternoon, German troops opened 5,730 cylinders of chlorine gas along a 4-mile front near Ypres, Belgium. The gas, heavier than air, rolled across no man's land in a yellow-green cloud 30 feet high. French colonial troops, Algerian and territorial divisions, saw it coming and didn't understand what they were seeing. Some thought it was a smokescreen. Others recognized it as something worse, but had no idea what to do. When the cloud reached the Allied trenches, men began to die. Chlorine gas attacks the respiratory system. It reacts with the moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid. Victims cough, choke, their lungs fill with fluid. They drown in their own bodily fluids. The gas at Ypres killed 5,000 men in 10 minutes and disabled another 10,000. But it also killed something else. Every horse within reach of that yellow-green cloud suffered the same fate as the soldiers. Transport horses, artillery horses, cavalry mounts tied to picket lines behind the trenches, they breathed the same air. They died the same deaths. The historical record of how many horses died in that first gas attack is incomplete. The focus, understandably, was on human casualties. But veterinary reports from the days following April 22nd document hundreds of horses showing signs of gas poisoning. Their symptoms were identical to those of human victims: labored breathing, foaming at the mouth, pulmonary edema, collapse, death. The German High Command had achieved tactical surprise. They had broken the Allied line, but they had also created a crisis that would define the rest of the war for both sides. If gas was going to be a weapon, if this was the future of warfare, then every living thing on the battlefield needed protection. Soldiers would get masks. But what about the horses? The problem seemed insurmountable. Designing a gas mask for a human being was difficult enough. The mask had to create an airtight seal around the face, filter out poisonous agents, allow the wearer to breathe, and not impair vision so severely that the soldier couldn't fight. Early masks were primitive, often just cloth pads soaked in chemical solutions held over the mouth and nose. They were better than nothing, but not by much. The British Army alone went through 16 different mask designs between 1915 and 1918, each one an improvement, each one desperately needed, as the Germans introduced new gases. Phosgene, introduced in December 1915, was 12 times more lethal than chlorine. Mustard gas, deployed in July 1917, didn't need to be inhaled to cause injuries. It burned exposed skin and caused blindness. Designing a mask for a horse presented challenges that dwarfed the human version. A horse's head is enormous, elongated and asymmetrical. The muzzle alone is longer than a human head. Horses breathe only through their noses, unlike humans who can breathe through their mouths as well, meaning any mask had to allow unrestricted nasal breathing, or the horse would suffocate. Horses can't communicate that a mask is uncomfortable or that they can't breathe properly. They can't adjust a mask that's slipping or leaking. And horses panic. A frightened horse is a lethal weapon to everyone nearby, and putting a confining apparatus over a horse's head that blocks its vision and restricts its breathing is an excellent way to create a panicked horse. The British, French, German, and American armies all developed horse gas masks. The British Animal Management and Veterinary Services, working with chemical warfare experts, produced the first functional designs in late 1915. The early versions were hoods made of rubberized canvas that covered the entire head. Chemical filters, initially just pads soaked in sodium thiosulfate solution, were built into the nose area. Later versions incorporated charcoal and chemical absorbents. Glass or transparent celluloid panels were fitted over the eyes so the horse could see, at least partially. Straps and buckles secured the mask to the horse's head, and the ears protruded through specially cut holes. The masks were hot, claustrophobic, and frightening to the animals. Training horses to accept them required patience, time, and calm conditions, 3 things in short supply on the Western Front. The process began with getting the horse accustomed to the mask being near its face, then briefly touching its muzzle, then being placed over the nose for a few seconds. Over days and weeks, if conditions allowed, the horse would gradually tolerate wearing the mask for longer periods. But this training assumed a rear area environment, not the chaos of the front lines where artillery fire and the constant movement of troops made systematic training nearly impossible. The reality was that most horses never received proper training. They encountered the masks for the first time during an actual gas attack, which meant they encountered them while terrified. Gas attacks were preceded by warning systems. Sentries would ring bells or sound klaxons the moment gas was detected. Soldiers had perhaps 60 seconds to get their masks on. Horse handlers had to mask themselves first. They were no good to the animals if they were choking to death, and then attempt to mask panicking horses in near-zero visibility as a cloud of poison rolled toward them. Veterinary reports from the war described scenes of absolute chaos. Horses rearing and bucking as handlers tried to force masks over their heads. Horses bolting with masks half on, the straps tangling, the animals running blind into obstacles or off cliffs. Horses so terrified they had to be abandoned because the handler couldn't get close enough to mask them without being kicked to death. In some cases, handlers made the agonizing decision to cut horses loose rather than watch them die slowly from gas poisoning, knowing the horses would likely die anyway, but at least wouldn't be trapped. The masks themselves had severe limitations. They reduced the horse's field of vision to almost nothing. The glass or celluloid eyepieces fogged up within minutes from the horse's breath. The filters became saturated with moisture and stopped working. In hot weather, horses overheated inside the masks and collapsed from heat stroke. In cold weather, the moisture from their breath froze, blocking the air passages. And the masks only protected against gases that attacked the respiratory system. Mustard gas, which burned the skin, rendered the masks partially useless unless they were combined with full body coverings, which were never successfully developed. Despite these problems, the masks were issued to frontline units in the hundreds of thousands. British records indicate that approximately 167,000 horse gas masks were manufactured and distributed by 1918. German production numbers were likely similar. French and American forces produced their own versions. The photographic evidence shows that by 1917, gas masks for horses were standard equipment in every sector where gas attacks were common. But did they work? The answer is complicated. When properly fitted, when the horse had been trained to accept the mask, when the handler got it on in time, when the gas wasn't too concentrated, when the attack was brief, yes, they worked. Veterinary casualty statistics show a measurable decrease in gas-related horse deaths after the introduction of masks compared to the period immediately following the first gas attacks. British Veterinary Corps records from 1917 indicate that masked horses had a survival rate of approximately 85% during gas attacks, compared to nearly 100% mortality for unmasked animals in the same concentrations of gas. But those statistics don't capture the full horror. An 85% survival rate means that 15% died anyway. It means that in a typical artillery battery with 200 horses, 30 would die even with masks. It means that across the Western Front, where hundreds of thousands of horses were deployed, thousands died in every major gas attack, despite the masks. And the statistics don't account for the horses who survived the initial attack but suffered permanent lung damage, chronic respiratory problems that rendered them unable to work and led to their eventual destruction. The German photograph from 1917, the one showing the driver and his two horses all wearing gas masks, was likely taken during training or immediately after a gas attack. The fact that all three are masked suggests this was a posed photograph, possibly for propaganda purposes or for training materials. The Germans were documenting their gas defense procedures, showing that they could protect their logistical assets. But the image, intended to demonstrate preparedness, instead reveals something darker. Look at the horse's posture in these photographs. They stand unnaturally still. Their heads are lowered. This isn't the alert, ears-forward stance of a healthy horse. These are exhausted animals, possibly in shock, definitely stressed. The masks have turned them into grotesque parodies of horses, their natural forms hidden behind industrial apparatus. They look like insects, like alien creatures, like anything but the animals they are. The handlers who worked with these horses left behind accounts that are difficult to read. One British veterinary officer, Captain Sidney Galtray, wrote in his memoir, The Horse and the War, about attempting to mask a team of artillery horses during a phosgene attack near Ypres in 1917. He described getting his own mask on, then moving to the horses. The lead horse, a gray named Whisper, had been trained with the mask and stood relatively still as Galtray fitted it over her head. The second horse, untrained, fought violently. By the time Galtray subdued him and got the mask on, the third horse was already showing symptoms of gas exposure. Galtray masked the third horse anyway, but the animal died within the hour, its lungs too badly damaged. Galtray wrote that the worst part wasn't the horse dying. Horses died every day. The worst part was knowing that the mask might have saved it if he'd been faster, if the horse had been trained, if he'd had help. The guilt of those calculations, deciding in seconds which animal to try to save first, haunted the veterinary personnel throughout the war. The casualty figures for horses in World War I are staggering. Of the approximately 8 million horses that served in the war across all fronts and all nations, more than 6 million died. That's a 75% casualty rate. Gas was responsible for a fraction of that total, perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 deaths based on available veterinary records, but the impact of gas went beyond direct casualties. Gas attacks created zones where horses couldn't be used at all. Entire sectors of the Western Front became impassable for horse-drawn transport after heavy gas bombardments because the gas lingered in low-lying areas for days or weeks. This forced armies to find alternative supply routes, slowing offensives and complicating logistics. The psychological impact on the horses was severe. Animals that survived multiple gas attacks became increasingly difficult to handle, flinching at sudden movements, panicking at loud noises, showing what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress. The veterinary services did what they could. The British Army's Army Veterinary Corps grew to 27,000 personnel by 1918, operating 150 veterinary hospitals just behind the front lines. These facilities treated approximately 2.5 million animals during the war, achieving a 78% recovery rate for non-fatal injuries. But gas injuries were among the most difficult to treat. Horses that survived the initial attack often developed chronic respiratory conditions that prevented them from working. These animals were typically euthanized, adding to the death toll weeks or months after the actual gas exposure. The French Army operated similar facilities, as did the Germans, though German veterinary records were largely destroyed in World War II, making precise statistics difficult to obtain. American forces, entering the war in 1917, relied heavily on British veterinary expertise and equipment, including gas masks. The American Expeditionary Forces brought approximately 182,000 horses and mules to France. Of these, approximately 68,000 died, with gas accounting for an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 deaths. What happened to the masks after the war? Most were destroyed. Gas masks, both human and equine, were considered obsolete once the fighting stopped. The chemicals they contained were toxic, the materials degraded quickly, and there was no peacetime use for them. A few were kept by museums. The Imperial War Museums in London has several examples in its collection, including the German model visible in the 1917 photograph. The National Army Museum holds British examples. These artifacts, preserved under glass, are among the most disturbing objects in any war museum collection. The masks represent a moment when warfare had become so inhuman that it stopped being about killing enemy soldiers and became about killing everything. Gas doesn't care about the Geneva Conventions or the laws of war. It kills indiscriminately, and the fact that armies spent significant resources designing protection for animals demonstrates how thoroughly gas had transformed the battlefield. The masks also represent a strange kind of mercy, a recognition that animals serving in the war deserve protection, even if that protection was imperfect and often arrived too late. But there's another way to read the existence of these masks, one that's less charitable. The masks weren't about mercy. They were about maintaining logistics. Armies needed horses to function. Protecting the horses wasn't about caring for the animals. It was about preserving military effectiveness. The masks were equipment, no different from maintaining a truck or repairing a bridge. The fact that the equipment happened to be a living creature was almost incidental to the calculation. The reality probably contains elements of both perspectives. Some handlers genuinely cared about their animals and did everything possible to protect them. The veterinary personnel, in particular, chose their profession because they wanted to help animals. But the institutional military perspective was purely utilitarian. Horses were assets, valuable ones, but assets nonetheless. After the war, millions of horses who survived faced a bleak future. The British Army alone had more than 300,000 horses in France when the armistice was signed in November 1918. Transporting them back to Britain would have been expensive and logistically complex. Most were sold to French farmers or sent to slaughterhouses. Of the approximately 1 million horses Britain sent to the Western Front, fewer than 62,000 returned home. The rest were killed, sold, or died of wounds and disease in the immediate post-war period. The fate of the German horses was worse. Germany, defeated and economically devastated, had no resources to maintain hundreds of thousands of horses. Many were slaughtered for food during the harsh winter of 1918 to 1919, when much of Germany was starving. Others were seized by the Allied occupation forces. The horses that had pulled German guns, hauled German supplies, and worn German gas masks simply vanished from historical record, their fate undocumented in the chaos of defeat. American forces faced their own difficult decisions. The United States had shipped 182,000 horses and mules to Europe at enormous expense. Bringing them back would cost nearly as much as buying new animals. In the end, approximately 60,000 were returned to the United States. The rest were sold or destroyed. Public outcry in America about the fate of the horses led to reforms in how the military handled animals in future conflicts, but those reforms came too late for the horses of World War I. A few individual horses became famous and were saved because of their stories. A British artillery horse named Warrior survived the entire war, serving from 1914 to 1918, including the Somme, Passchendaele, and the German Spring Offensive of 1918. He returned to Britain and lived until 1941, dying at age 33. His story became the subject of books and documentaries. But Warrior was an exception, notable precisely because he survived when millions didn't. The horses who wore gas masks left behind no memorials. There are monuments to war horses. The Animals in War Memorial in London, dedicated in 2004, honors all animals that served in British military conflicts. It features sculptures of horses, mules, and dogs with inscriptions reading, "They had no choice." The memorial is powerful and moving, but it doesn't specifically commemorate the gas mask horses, those creatures caught in the intersection of two forms of modern horror, industrial warfare and chemical weapons. What should we remember about these horses? The easy answer is to emphasize their suffering, to focus on the cruelty and waste of it all. And there was cruelty and waste. Millions of animals died in a war they didn't understand, serving causes they had no stake in, killed by weapons they couldn't conceive of. The image of a horse wearing a gas mask is inherently tragic, a visual representation of how thoroughly human conflicts corrupt the natural world. But there's more to the story than suffering. The horses of the Western Front were essential to the war effort in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from our modern perspective. Without them, the armies couldn't have functioned. The artillery couldn't have moved. The supplies couldn't have been delivered. The war as it was fought couldn't have happened. These animals weren't passive victims. They were active participants in one of the most significant events in human history, and their contribution deserves recognition beyond simply lamenting their deaths. The gas masks represent humanity's complicated relationship with the animals we use in war. We ask them to serve. We put them in danger. We recognize they need protection, so we invent elaborate equipment to keep them alive. But we do all of this not because we value them as living creatures with their own inherent worth, but because we need them. The moment we don't need them anymore, As happened in 1918, they become expendable. World War I was called the war to end all wars. It didn't end war, but it did mark the beginning of the end for horses in combat. World War II would be fought primarily with mechanized transport. Trucks, tanks, and aircraft replaced horses in most roles. The horse's 5,000-year history as a weapon of war was essentially over by 1945. Chemical weapons, paradoxically, continued. Despite international treaties banning their use, gas has been deployed in conflicts ever since, from Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 to Iraq's war with Iran in the 1980s to Syria's civil war in the 2010s. But horses haven't been part of those conflicts, not in significant numbers. The photograph of the German transport driver and his masked horses exists in a specific moment in history, a moment when two eras overlapped. The ancient practice of using horses in war met the modern practice of chemical warfare. The result was surreal, tragic, and ultimately futile. The masks couldn't save enough horses. The horses couldn't win the war. The war couldn't justify what it cost in human lives or animal lives. What remains is the image itself. The driver, anonymous behind his mask, his identity erased by the apparatus covering his face. The horses, their natural grace and beauty, hidden beneath canvas and rubber and glass. All three stand in mud because the Western Front was always mud. Behind them, invisible in the photograph but present in every image from that war, is the devastation. The shattered trees, the destroyed villages, the endless lines of trenches, the unburied dead. The photograph was taken to document a solution, a way of protecting valuable military assets from a new weapon. But what it actually documents is a failure. A failure of human civilization to resolve conflicts without mass slaughter. A failure to protect the innocent, whether human or animal. A failure to recognize that some weapons are so horrible they shouldn't be used, and some costs are too high to pay. In the archives of Imperial War Museums, thousands of photographs from World War I are preserved. Images of soldiers, trenches, battles, equipment. Among them are approximately 200 photographs that specifically show horses wearing gas masks. Each photograph tells the same story with slight variations. A handler and his horses all masked. A cavalry unit in training, horses lined up wearing masks. A veterinary station with masked horses being treated for gas exposure. A transport column moving through a destroyed village, every horse wearing a mask even though no gas attack is imminent because the threat is constant and the time to mask during an attack is measured in seconds. These photographs were taken for military purposes. Documentation, training, propaganda. But they've become something else over the decades since. They've become evidence. Proof that this happened, that humans did this, that we created weapons so terrible we had to protect the animals from them, and then we used the weapons anyway. The images are witnesses to choices made and consequences accepted. The horses in these photographs are all dead now, obviously. They've been dead for more than a century. The last veteran of World War I, a human veteran, died in 2012. The last horse veteran died decades before that. No living creature remains who experienced what these photographs show. But the photographs remain, and the questions they raise remain. Why do we go to war? What are we willing to sacrifice? What are we willing to make others sacrifice? When we look at a photograph of a horse wearing a gas mask, we're forced to confront the reality that war's costs extend far beyond human casualties. 8 million horses served in World War I, 6 million died. Those aren't abstract statistics. Each one was an individual animal with its own personality, preferences, fears, and capacity for suffering. The veterinary personnel who served on the Western Front left behind accounts that emphasize the individuality of the horses. Captain Galtrey, mentioned earlier, wrote extensively about the horses he treated. He gave them names, described their temperaments, mourned them when they died. One passage in his memoir describes a horse named Darky, a black gelding who served with an artillery battery from 1914 to 1917. Darky survived multiple gas attacks, always allowing his handler to mask him without resistance. Galtrey wrote that Darky seemed to understand that the mask, uncomfortable as it was, kept him safe. In March 1917, Darky was killed by shell fire, not gas. Galtrey wrote that he was grateful Darky died quickly from an explosion rather than from drowning in his own fluids from gas poisoning. That was how low the standards had become by 1917. A quick death from high explosives was considered a mercy. Other veterinary personnel left similar accounts. French veterinarian Jean Pichon wrote about treating horses after gas attacks, describing the sounds they made while dying. Horses can't scream the way humans do, but they make sounds when they're in pain, whinnies and grunts that Pichon described as haunting. He wrote that the worst cases were the horses who survived the initial attack, but whose lungs were so badly damaged they could no longer function. These horses would stand with their heads lowered, breathing in shallow, rapid gasps, slowly suffocating over hours or days until a veterinarian could euthanize them. The standard method was a gunshot to the head. Quick, certain, at least as merciful as anything else available. The German perspective is harder to access because fewer German veterinary accounts were preserved or translated. But German military doctrine regarding animals was similar to British and French practices. Horses were valuable. They should be protected when possible. They should be treated when injured. They should be destroyed when they could no longer work. The German gas masks for horses were well engineered, as most German military equipment was. They featured better filtration systems than early British models and more sophisticated securing straps. But they had the same fundamental limitations. They were hot, they restricted vision, they terrified untrained horses, and they only worked if you got them on in time. American involvement in the war, beginning in 1917, brought fresh perspectives on animal welfare. American public opinion had been influenced by the animal welfare movement, which was stronger in the United States than in Europe at that time. American newspapers published stories about horses in the war, often emphasizing their suffering. Public pressure led to the American Expeditionary Forces establishing veterinary services that were, by some measures, more comprehensive than their European counterparts. American veterinarians introduced new treatment protocols for gas exposure, including oxygen therapy for horses with lung damage. The survival rate for American horses suffering from gas exposure was slightly higher than for British horses, though still tragically low. But all of these efforts, all of the masks and the training and the veterinary care, existed within a larger context that makes them seem almost absurd. The Western Front was a machine for killing. It killed men and horses with equal efficiency, and while it's true that the gas masks saved some horses, it's also true that those saved horses were simply returned to a battlefield where they would likely die from something else. Saving a horse from gas in 1917 meant it might die from artillery in 1918, or from exhaustion, or from infection, or from any of the countless other ways the war found to kill things. The war ended on November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m. The guns fell silent. The gas attack stopped. The horses who survived that moment, who were still alive when the ceasefire took effect, stood in the sudden quiet without understanding what had changed. They didn't know the war was over. They only knew they were exhausted, hungry, hurt, and far from home. In the weeks that followed, as armies demobilized and began the long process of dealing with millions of displaced soldiers, the fate of the horses was decided. Some were kept by occupation forces. Some were sold to civilians. Most were killed. The gas masks no longer needed were collected and destroyed or stored in warehouses where they deteriorated. The veterinary hospitals closed. The handlers went home. And the horses, those that were left, simply vanished into the chaos of the post-war period. A few statistics made it into the official records. Britain lost approximately 940,000 horses during the war across all theaters, not just the Western Front. France lost 740,000. Germany lost 715,000. Austria-Hungary lost 1.1 million. Russia lost approximately 2 million. The United States lost 68,000. Smaller nations lost tens of thousands more. Total equine casualties for World War I are estimated at between 8 million and 10 million, making it proportionally deadlier for horses than for humans. These numbers are almost too large to process. 10 million horses. Try to visualize that. Imagine a single horse, a living animal with warmth and breath and a heartbeat. Now multiply that by 10 million. They filled fields and roads and forests across Europe. They hauled guns through Belgium and France and Italy and Eastern Europe. They died in the mud and were blown apart by shells and choked on gas and collapsed from exhaustion and were shot when they could no longer work. And then when the war ended, most of the survivors were killed anyway because transporting them home was too expensive or inconvenient. If there's a lesson in the story of horses wearing gas masks on the Western Front, it's not an uplifting one. The lesson is that when humans decide to fight, we'll use every resource available, regardless of the cost to those who have no choice in the matter. We'll invent elaborate solutions to protect those resources, not out of compassion, but out of necessity. And when the fighting is over, we'll discard what we no longer need. But maybe there's a second lesson, one that emerges not from the institutional decisions, but from the individual actions of people like Captain Galtray and the thousands of other handlers and veterinary personnel who tried to save the horses. They couldn't change the larger system. They couldn't stop the war or prevent the gas attacks. But they could mask one more horse, treat one more wound, make one more animal's death quicker and less painful. In the face of overwhelming horror, they chose to do what they could. That might seem like faint praise, finding nobility in mitigating the symptoms while the disease raged unchecked. But it matters. The photograph of the German driver and his masked horses exists because someone took the time to document what was happening. That documentation, those photographs and veterinary reports and personal memoirs ensure that we remember. Memory is how we honor the dead, even when the dead are animals who served a century ago in a war that killed millions. The gas masks themselves, the physical objects, are rare now. Most were destroyed in the 1920s. The few that survive in museum collections are fragile. The rubber perished, the canvas brittle, the glass eyepieces cracked or clouded. Conservators handle them carefully, knowing they're irreplaceable artifacts of a specific moment in history. When these masks are displayed in exhibitions, visitors often stop and stare, trying to process what they're seeing. The masks don't look like they should be real. They look like props from a science fiction film, too strange and disturbing to have actually been used. But they were used. Tens of thousands of them, perhaps hundreds of thousands, across all the armies fighting on the Western Front. Every major museum with World War I collections has at least one example. The Imperial War Museums in London has several, displayed alongside human gas masks to show the parallel development of protective equipment. The National Army Museum has a particularly well-preserved British model, complete with its original storage bag and instruction manual. The manual is chilling in its matter-of-fact tone, describing the fitting procedure as if it were explaining how to saddle a horse rather than how to seal an animal's head inside a potentially life-saving apparatus. German examples are rarer in British and American collections, but exist in German military museums. The Militärhistorisches Museum in Dresden has 2 horse gas masks on display, one manufactured in 1916 and one from 1918. The 1918 version shows significant improvements in design, with better ventilation and more robust straps, evidence that the Germans continued refining the equipment throughout the war even as it became clear they were losing. French museums hold their own examples, as do smaller military collections across Europe. Occasionally, a mask appears at auction, sold by the descendants of veterinary personnel who kept them as souvenirs. These sales are controversial. Some argue that items like gas masks should be in public collections where they can educate people about the war. Others point out that private ownership has preserved many artifacts that might otherwise have been lost. The debate continues, but the masks themselves, wherever they reside, remain powerful objects that communicate something no written description can fully capture. There's a photograph in the Canadian War Museum archives that shows the aftermath of a gas attack near Vimy Ridge in 1917. In the foreground, 3 dead horses lie in the mud, their bodies already beginning to bloat. Behind them, partially visible through the haze, is a supply wagon. On the wagon's seat sits a gas mask, presumably intended for one of the dead horses, but not deployed in time. The photograph is titled simply "Gas Casualties, April 1917." It doesn't elaborate. It doesn't need to. That single and used mask tells a complete story. Someone had the mask. Someone was supposed to put on the horse. Something went wrong. Maybe the attack came too fast. Maybe the horse panicked and couldn't be approached. Maybe the handler was overcome by gas before he could mask the horse. Whatever happened, the result is visible in the photograph. The mask sits unused. The horse is dead. War is full of these small failures, these moments when the equipment existed and the intention was there but circumstances prevented success. The gas attacks on the Western Front continued right up until the end of the war. The last major gas attack occurred on October 14, 1918, less than a month before the armistice. American forces near the Mules sector were hit with a combination of mustard gas and phosgene. Casualties included both men and horses. By this point in the war, gas discipline was well established. Soldiers and animals were masked within seconds of the alarm. But even with perfect execution, some died. The gas was simply too concentrated, or the exposure lasted too long, or the masks failed, or luck ran out. When the armistice took effect on November 11th, estimates suggest there were approximately 475,000 horses still serving with British forces in France and Belgium, 380,000 with French forces, unknown numbers with American forces, and rapidly diminishing numbers with the defeated German army. These animals, survivors of years of industrialized slaughter, faced an uncertain future. The British Army made a calculated decision. Shipping the horses home would cost approximately £70 per horse, a staggering expense for an economy devastated by 4 years of total war. The cheapest option was to sell them to French and Belgian farmers for £5 to £20 per horse, or to slaughterhouses for even less. Public outcry in Britain was immediate and intense. Letters flooded newspapers. The Daily Mail ran a campaign demanding the horses be brought home. The public sentiment was clear. These animals had served. They had earned better than being sold for meat. The government compromised. Officers' horses and horses that had distinguished records could be purchased by their handlers and returned to Britain at the handlers' expense. A small number of horses deemed historically significant would be returned at government expense. The rest would be sold. In the end, approximately 62,000 horses returned to Britain out of nearly 1 million that had been sent to France. The rest were sold, slaughtered, or died in the chaotic post-war period. The American decision was similar. Of 182,000 horses and mules shipped to France, about 60,000 returned. The remainder were sold to French farmers or to European governments. The official explanation was economic necessity. The unofficial reason was that many of the surviving horses were in poor condition, worn out by years of hard labor and inadequate nutrition. Bringing them back to the United States only to euthanize them seemed cruel. Selling them to farmers who needed draft animals seemed more humane, though whether French farmers wanted exhausted, traumatized war horses is unclear from the historical record. The fate of the German horses was sealed by defeat. Germany, blockaded and starving, couldn't feed its human population, let alone hundreds of thousands of horses. Allied occupation forces seized some for their own use. Others were purchased by civilians for food or labor. The rest were simply killed, their carcasses left to rot or processed for whatever use could be found. German veterinary records from this period are sparse, lost in the larger collapse of German record-keeping as the empire disintegrated and the Weimar Republic struggled into existence. In the decades following the war, the story of the horses gradually faded from public consciousness. The human tragedy of World War I, the 10 million soldiers killed and the 21 million wounded, overshadowed everything else. The war's impact on European society, the collapse of empires, the redrawing of borders, the seeds of future conflicts, all of this commanded historical attention. The horses, like so many other aspects of the war's logistics and infrastructure, became a footnote. But the photographs remained. In the 1960s and 1970s, as interest in World War I was rekindled by the 50th anniversary commemorations, researchers began systematically examining the photographic archives. The images of horses wearing gas masks provoked strong reactions. They seemed to encapsulate something essential about the war's nature, the way modern technology had perverted everything it touched, turning even the simple act of breathing into a potential death sentence that required elaborate mechanical intervention. Books began to include these images. The Horse in War by J.M. Brereton, published in 1976, dedicated significant space to the gas warfare experience. Simon Butler's The War Horses, The Tragic Fate of a Million Horses in the First World War, published in 2011, brought scholarly attention to the animal casualties. Documentaries produced by the BBC and other broadcasters featured segments on horses in the war, always including the gas mask photographs because they were visually striking and emotionally powerful. The images took on symbolic weight. They came to represent not just the specific horror of gas warfare, but the broader absurdity of World War I itself. Here were noble creatures, animals that had served humanity for thousands of years, reduced to grotesque masked figures because human beings had invented a weapon too terrible to use, except that they used it anyway. The masks made the horses look less than animal, more like machines, which was perhaps fitting for a war that treated living beings as mere components in vast military-industrial systems. Modern viewers looking at these photographs often express disbelief. The images seem too surreal, too dystopian to be real. But they are real. The masks existed. The horses wore them. The gas attacks happened. And the horses died, millions of them, whether the masks saved them temporarily or not. What do we owe these horses a century after their deaths? We can't bring them back. We can't undo what was done to them. We can't even accurately count them. The casualty figures are estimates based on incomplete records from chaotic wartime conditions. What we can do is remember. We can acknowledge that they were there, that they suffered, that they died in vast numbers for causes they couldn't understand in a war they didn't start. The memorial culture around World War I has evolved significantly over the past century. The major battlefields are preserved. Cemeteries hold the remains of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, marked with white crosses or headstones bearing names and dates. Monuments stand in town squares across Europe, listing the local men who never came home. Museums preserve artifacts and tell stories. The war is remembered, obsessively in some cases, as a catastrophic turning point in human history. But the animals are mostly absent from these commemorations. A few monuments exist. The Animals in War Memorial in London, unveiled in 2004, stands in Hyde Park with its stark inscription, "They had no choice." The memorial features bronze sculptures of a horse, a dog, and two mules walking through a gap in a wall, with additional bronze reliefs showing other animals used in war. It's a powerful memorial, but it's one of the few that specifically honors animal service and sacrifice. In France, where so many horses died, there is no major national memorial to the animals. Individual towns sometimes include references to horses on their war monuments, but they're secondary to the human names listed above them. The vast war cemeteries that dot the French and Belgian countryside contain only human remains. The horses were buried in mass graves if they were buried at all, or simply left where they fell to be consumed by the mud and time. This erasure from memory is understandable on one level. Human suffering in World War I was so immense, so overwhelming, that adding animal suffering to the accounting seems almost trivial by comparison. 20 million dead soldiers and civilians surely outweigh 8 million dead horses by any moral calculus. But understanding why the animals are forgotten doesn't make their absence from historical memory less significant. They were there. They were essential. And they deserve acknowledgement. The gas masks, those surviving examples in museum collections, serve as that acknowledgement. They're physical proof that the horses existed, that armies recognized their value enough to try to protect them, and that the protection was necessary because the weapons being used were so indiscriminate in their lethality. When a school group visits the Imperial War Museums and sees the horse gas mask in its display case, the children always react. They ask questions. They want to know if it worked, if the horse survived, how many horses had to wear these things. The mask provokes engagement with history in a way that statistics often don't. That's the value of the artifacts and the photographs. They make the abstract concrete. 8 million is a number too large to comprehend. But one horse standing in mud, wearing a grotesque mask, its eyes barely visible through fog glass, that's something you can understand. That's something you can empathize with. And if you can empathize with one, you can begin to grasp the magnitude of 8 million. The German photograph from 1917, the one showing the transport driver and his two masked horses, has been reproduced in dozens of books and hundreds of online articles about World War I. It's become iconic, though not in the way the photographer likely intended. It was meant to show preparedness, capability, the ability to defend against enemy gas attacks. What it actually shows is the depth of the horror that the war had become. When you need to mask horses, when the air itself is poisonous, when simply breathing can kill, something has gone profoundly wrong with human civilization. Chemical weapons were banned by international treaty after World War I. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in war. Most nations signed it, including Germany, France, Britain, and eventually the United States. The ban was imperfect and violated repeatedly in subsequent conflicts, but the principle was established. Gas was beyond the pale, too horrible even for war. But the ban came too late for the horses of the Western Front. They died not knowing that future generations would look back and declare that the weapon that killed them should never have been used. They died not knowing they were victims of something the world would later agree was a war crime. They simply died in mud and terror and pain, wearing masks that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, serving in a war that consumed everything it touched. The last horse veteran of World War I died sometime in the 1930s or early 1940s. The exact date is unknown because no one was keeping track. Unlike human veterans who received pensions and medical care, and whose deaths were recorded, the horses simply aged and died in obscurity. Some lived out their days on farms, pulling plows or wagons, their war service unknown to their post-war owners. Others were kept as mascots or pets by former handlers who couldn't bear to part with them. A few, like Warrior, became famous and were documented. But most just disappeared from history, their service unrecorded and unremembered. The gas masks outlived the horses that wore them, at least those masks that survived. The one in the Imperial War Museums has been on display for decades. Thousands of visitors see it every year. It sits in a case under controlled lighting, the temperature and humidity carefully regulated to slow its deterioration. Next to it is an information placard explaining what it is, when it was used, why it was necessary. The placard includes a photograph, possibly the same 1917 German photograph that has become so familiar, showing a horse wearing a similar mask. Museum visitors stop and read and move on. Some take photographs. Some don't. The mask sits there, a silent witness to events that happened more than a century ago, waiting for the next viewer who will pause and wonder about the horse that wore it. Did that horse survive? Was it trained to accept the mask? Did the handler get it on in time during an attack? Was the horse one of the millions that died, or one of the comparative few that survived? The mask offers no answers. It's just canvas and rubber and glass, preserved beyond its intended lifespan, serving now as an educational artifact rather than a piece of life-saving equipment. This is how history works. The events recede. The participants die. The artifacts remain, curated and interpreted by people born long after the events they represent. The meaning shifts. A gas mask designed to protect a military asset becomes a symbol of the war's horror. An object that was purely functional becomes laden with emotional and historical significance. The horse that wore it, long dead and forgotten, achieves a kind of immortality through the masked survival, even though we'll never know that specific horse's name or fate. The gas attacks on the Western Front ended in November 1918. They had killed approximately 90,000 soldiers and injured more than 1.2 million. The animal casualties are less precisely documented, but certainly numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The attacks had failed to break the stalemate. Gas proved to be a weapon that caused immense suffering without delivering decisive military advantage. Both sides used it because the other side did, a spiral of escalation that resulted in everyone being worse off, but no one able to stop unilaterally. That pattern of weapons that caused disproportionate suffering without proportionate military benefit would repeat throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. Chemical weapons in Ethiopia in 1935, in China in the 1930s and 1940s, in Yemen in the 1960s, in Iran and Iraq in the 1980s, in Syria in the 2010s. The international ban on chemical weapons has been violated repeatedly, though never again on the scale of World War I. And in none of these later conflicts were horses present in significant numbers. The mechanization of warfare that began in World War I was complete by World War II. Horses had been replaced by trucks and tanks. They were no longer military assets requiring protection. They were no longer victims of gas attacks because they were no longer on battlefields. In that sense, World War I represents both the beginning and the end of an era. The beginning of mechanized, industrial warfare. The end of the horse's role in combat. The gas mask horses stand at that intersection, creatures from an ancient military tradition suddenly confronted with the most modern of weapons. They represent a transitional moment when the old world met the new, and the new proved lethal. If you visit the Western Front today, you can still see the battlefield. The trenches have mostly filled in or been deliberately preserved as historical sites. The barbed wire is long gone. The shell craters have softened and grassed over, though the ground still shows the distinctive wave pattern that marks old battlefield terrain. The forests have regrown, though the trees are younger than they should be, the old growth having been destroyed by artillery. In some places, the earth is still toxic from a gas, and the chemicals used in explosives, the soil poisoned so thoroughly that nothing grows even a century later. There are no horse cemeteries. The horses weren't buried with military honors. Their remains, where they weren't processed for industrial use or animal feed, simply became part of the landscape. The bones have long since degraded, the organic matter consumed by the soil. But they were there. Under the fields and forests of northern France and Belgium, mixed with the earth, are the remains of millions of horses. They're part of the ground now, indistinguishable from it, gone but not entirely absent. Farmers in the region still occasionally plow up artifacts from the war. Shells, mostly, rusted and dangerous, requiring disposal by military explosives teams. Sometimes pieces of equipment. Rarely, a gas mask, either human or equine, preserved by the mud and anoxic conditions underground. When horse gas masks are found this way, they're usually turned over to local museums or historical societies. They're cleaned, cataloged, added to collections. Another piece of evidence that this happened, that the horses were there, that the masks existed, that all of it was real. The story of horses wearing gas masks on the Western Front is not a story with a satisfying conclusion. There's no moment of redemption, no victory snatched from the jaws of defeat, no lesson learned that prevented future atrocities. The horses suffered. Many died. The war ended. Most of the survivors were killed anyway. The masks were destroyed or put in museums. The people who remember the horses firsthand died decades ago. What remains is the historical record, incomplete and fragmentary, and the artifacts carefully preserved and the photographs digitized and accessible, and the questions they raise about what we're willing to do to each other and to the innocent creatures caught in the crossfire of human conflicts. Perhaps the only appropriate response to this story is simply to acknowledge it. To say this happened. These horses existed. They served. They suffered. They died. They deserve to be remembered. Not romanticized, not turned into symbols or metaphors, but remembered as what they were, living animals caught in circumstances beyond their control, doing what they were trained to do, enduring what they had to endure until they couldn't endure anymore. The gas masks, those strange and disturbing objects, are a testament to human ingenuity and human cruelty existing side by side. We were clever enough to invent protection for the horses. We were cruel enough to create the conditions that made that protection necessary. Both capabilities, the creative and the destructive, are essential parts of who we are as a species. The masks prove it. They're solutions to a problem we created, evidence of our desire to preserve life existing within a context of industrial-scale killing. When you look at that 1917 photograph, the German driver and his two masked horses standing in the mud, try to see beyond the surreal quality of the image. Try to imagine the moment itself. The smell of the gas lingering in the air, bitter and metallic. The sound of distant artillery, never fully silent on the Western Front. The exhaustion in the horses' posture, the weight of the masks on their heads. The driver's own mask muffling his breathing, limiting his vision, reminding him with every breath that the air outside the mask could kill him. Try to imagine the hours before that photograph was taken. Was there an attack? Did the driver get the masks on his horses in time? Did other horses nearby die, while these ones survived? What happened in the hours after the photograph? Did these horses make it through the war, or did they die days or weeks later from artillery, or disease, or exhaustion? We'll never know. The photograph preserves one moment, but tells us nothing about what came before or after. That's the nature of historical evidence. It's fragmentary. It's incomplete. We have pieces of the story, photographs and documents and artifacts and occasional first-hand accounts, and we assemble them into narratives that approximate what happened. But we're always working with gaps, unknowns, questions that can't be answered because the witnesses are dead and the evidence doesn't exist or was never created in the first place. What we know for certain is this: gas was used extensively on the Western Front from 1915 to 1918. Horses were present in enormous numbers, essential to military operations. Gas killed horses just as it killed men. Armies developed gas masks for horses and issued them to frontline units. The masks saved some horses and failed to save others. Millions of horses died during the war from all causes. Most of the survivors were killed or sold after the war. The masks that remain in museums are rare artifacts of a specific technological response to a specific problem in a specific war. What we don't know and will never know: how many horses wore masks? How many were saved by the masks? How many died despite wearing them? What were their names? What were their individual personalities and histories? How much did they suffer? Did they understand, in whatever way horses understand things, what was happening to them? These unknowns are perhaps more important than the knowns. They remind us that behind every statistic, every number, every casualty figure were individuals. The 8 million horses who died in World War I were in a collective. They were 8 million individual animals, each with its own experience of the war, each with its own death. We can't know their stories individually. The best we can do is acknowledge that those stories existed, that each of those 8 million deaths represented the end of a life that had value, if only to the horse itself. The memorial inscriptions that read "they had no choice" are accurate but insufficient. Of course they had no choice. Animals never have a choice about human wars. But emphasizing their lack of choice can make them seem passive, when the reality is that they were active participants working and struggling, and trying to survive just as the human soldiers were. They hauled the guns and pulled the wagons and carried the supplies because they were trained to do so and because they were compelled to do so, but also because many horses form bonds with their handlers and will work for them even in terrifying circumstances. The relationship between the handlers and their horses was complex. Some handlers were cruel, viewing the animals as expendable equipment to be driven until they broke. Some were indifferent, doing the minimum required to keep the horses functional. Some genuinely cared about their animals, did everything possible to protect them, mourned when they died. The veterinary personnel, almost by definition, cared. You don't become a veterinarian unless you care about animals. The accounts left by veterinary officers are filled with frustration at their inability to save more, grief at the ones they lost, small moments of satisfaction when they succeeded in healing a wounded horse or preventing a death. Captain Galtray, whose memoir has been quoted several times in this account, wrote in his conclusion, "I have seen terrible things in this war. I have seen men die in every way men can die. But the horses haunt me most. They asked nothing. They gave everything. They trusted us to care for them, and we brought them to hell." That sentiment expressed by someone who was there, who tried to save them, who failed more often than he succeeded, captures something essential about the tragedy of the animals in World War I. The gas masks themselves as objects are fascinating from an engineering perspective. They represent a significant technical challenge overcome under extreme time pressure. The first gas attacks occurred in April 1915. By late 1915, functional horse gas masks were being produced and issued. That's roughly 8 months from problem identification to deployed solution, an impressive timeline considering the complexity of the challenge. The masks evolved rapidly. Early versions were crude, essentially bags with chemical-soaked pads that offered minimal protection. By 1917, the masks featured proper filtration systems, adjustable straps, transparent eye panels, and designs that accommodated the horse's need to breathe heavily during exertion. Later versions included improvements like better seals around the muzzle, more durable materials, and enhanced filters that could handle multiple gas types. But even the best designs had inherent limitations. A horse's head is simply too large and awkwardly shaped to seal perfectly. The ears had to protrude, creating potential leak points. The eye panels fogged constantly. The filters became saturated with moisture from a horse's breath, reducing their effectiveness over time. And the masks were hot, desperately hot, especially in summer. Horses regulate temperature partly through breathing, and covering their entire head with canvas and rubber interfered with that process. Horses wearing masks in warm weather could overheat dangerously within 15 or 20 minutes. The training protocols developed for acclimating horses to the masks show surprising sophistication in animal psychology. Trainers understood that forcing a mask onto a panicked horse would create trauma and resistance. Instead, they used gradual desensitization. The process began with letting the horse see and smell the mask, then touching the horse's face with it briefly, then holding it near the muzzle for a few seconds. Over days or weeks, the horse would learn to tolerate having the mask placed over its nose and eventually its entire head. This training was effective when time allowed, but frontline conditions rarely allowed systematic training. Horses arriving at the front often received minimal introduction to the masks, maybe a few hours at most, before being deployed to areas where gas attacks were likely. The result was predictable chaos when attacks occurred. Untrained horses fought the masks violently, often injuring themselves or their handlers in the process. Some horses never adapted. Veterinary records document cases of horses that simply could not tolerate the masks under any circumstances. These animals posed a dilemma for commanders. Should they be kept in rear areas where gas attacks were less likely, reducing military effectiveness? Should they be transferred to other fronts where gas wasn't used? Should they be destroyed and replaced with more adaptable animals? Different armies and different commanders made different decisions, but the underlying calculus was always utilitarian. The needs of the military operation came first. The horse's well-being was secondary. The post-war fate of the masks mirrors the post-war fate of the horses. Most were destroyed. Chemical filters contained toxic materials that degraded over time, making storage dangerous. The rubber components perished within a few years, cracking and becoming brittle. Canvas rotted in damp conditions. By the mid-1920s, most surviving masks were unusable, even if someone had wanted to use them. The few that were preserved for historical purposes survived by accident as much as by intention. A veterinary officer keeping one as a souvenir. A museum accepting a donation from a veteran. A military depot storing equipment that was forgotten and rediscovered decades later. Each surviving mask represents chance as much as deliberate preservation. Today, conservators face challenges maintaining these artifacts. The materials continue to degrade despite controlled storage conditions. The rubber is particularly problematic, breaking down at the molecular level in ways that can't be reversed. Museums must decide whether to display these fragile objects, knowing that exposure to light and air accelerates deterioration, or to keep them in storage where they'll be preserved but not seen. Most compromise, displaying masks for limited periods, then returning them to storage, rotating different examples through exhibitions. The educational value of these artifacts is significant. Documentary evidence, photographs, and written records can describe what gas masks for horses looked like and how they functioned. But seeing an actual mask, a physical object that was worn by a real horse during the war, creates a different kind of understanding. It makes the abstract concrete. It transforms historical knowledge into visceral comprehension. When students examine a horse gas mask in a museum, they're often most struck by the size. Photographs don't convey scale effectively. The masks are enormous, far larger than human gas masks, heavy and cumbersome even when empty. Imagining a horse wearing this thing, working while wearing it, hauling artillery or supplies while its head is covered by this apparatus, the physical reality of what was asked of these animals becomes clear in a way that reading about it can't quite convey. The smell, too, though this is rarely mentioned in historical accounts. The masks smelled strongly of rubber and chemicals, even when new. After use, they would smell of the horse's sweat and breath, of gas residue, of fear. Handlers describe the smell as nauseating, especially when removing masks from horses after an attack, the interior saturated with moisture and chemical traces. This sensory dimension of the experience is almost entirely lost to history. We have the objects, but not the complete context of what it was like to use them. The sound is also lost. What did horses sound like breathing through these masks? Their breathing was already audible, horses being large animals with substantial lung capacity. Through a mask, with filters and restricted airways, the sound would have been different, labored, possibly distressing to handlers who knew what normal equine breathing sounded like. But no recordings exist. The technology for field audio recording existed in 1917, but was rare and expensive. No one thought to record the sound of masked horses breathing. Why would they? It seemed like a minor detail at the time. A century later, it's a gap in our understanding that can never be filled. Tell me your favorite animal war story I should talk about next. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.